palaces, the most spectacular and lavish homes on Earth. Luxuriously designed for the royals who wanted the biggest and the best. Behind the golden gates of these royal megastructures are incredible stories waiting to be discovered. Infamous monarchs from history, and the artists, designers, and engineers who turned their grand visions into a reality. These are the most opulent, flamboyant, and innovative royal residences around the world. This time, Château de Fontainebleau began life as a medieval castle in the 12th century before being turned into a Renaissance masterpiece in the 1500s. Kings and emperors of France resided at this grand country retreat for nearly 750 years, making Fontainebleau one of the world's greatest palaces. Lying 55 kilometers southeast of Paris, Fontainebleau has stood in the forests of rural France for nearly 1,000 years. In his memoirs, Napoleon Bonaparte called the imposing structure the true home of kings. Today, Château de Fontainebleau is a gigantic structure containing 1,500 rooms. With constant renovations and additions by kings and emperors over 7 centuries, it has changed dramatically through the years.
In French, the word château means both castle and palace. And this is not an accident because, of course, royal houses were first in the Middle Ages castles and then later developed into very grand palaces as we know them today. So Fontainebleau starts off as a castle round a courtyard with a keep, and indeed the keep of 1137 still survives. It was Francis I that decided to transform this castle into something which we would describe as a palace by building huge corridors and galleries attached to the original castle, while keeping some of the original buildings.
King Francis I's 16th century reimagining of Fontainebleau retained a section of the medieval castle, which still stands today. Vincent Droguet is the Director of Heritage and Collections at the château.
Alors nous sommes ici dans la plus vieille cour du château, qu'on appelle la cour ovale. La particularité de cette cour, c'est que François Ier y a fait travailler à partir des années 1528-1530, mais qu'il a souhaité conserver les bâtiments médiévaux qui étaient encore en place et qu'il a fait installer ces bâtiments sur les fondations médiévales et qu'il a même conservé à l'extrémité occidentale de cette cour le gros donjon, ce qu'on appelle la grosse vieille tour de Saint-Louis, un bâtiment qui a été conservé jusqu'à nos jours, un donjon avec des murs très épais.
Although much has changed about Fontainebleau over the centuries, the dungeon was kept fully intact by every monarch who resided here. Each of the royal dynasties of France saw it as a symbol of heritage and antiquity. Now housing palace administration on the inside, the robust exterior stonework of the dungeon remains solid, almost a millennium later.
In the Middle Ages, building was done by craftsmen, master craftsmen, who designed and built the building. They were responsible for both. And the patron would come to the master craftsman and describe what they wanted, and then they would work out together what was being built on site, coming back to the site regularly to see whether the progress was what they expected.
Simplement, ce sont certainement des maîtres maçons qui travaillaient pour le roi, qui ont construit le donjon qu'on peut encore voir aujourd'hui, qui est un donjon avec des murs extrêmement épais, construit avec des matériaux pris dans des carrières proches de Fontainebleau.
One of the key materials that's used in this castle is sandstone that was sourced locally from a forest, and also rubble stones, and those have been set together using a mix, like a paste called mortar.
Louis VII was the first known king to reside at the medieval castle of Fontainebleau in the 12th century. And his successors were still visiting the castle some 300 years later.
Le château a été habité par les rois de France, pas de manière permanente, mais tout de même régulière, pendant toute la période médiévale, pendant tout le Moyen-Âge. Et puis, à partir du début du XVe siècle, le château a été abandonné parce que le roi ne réside plus à Paris.
The castle was vacated by the French monarchy, and it remained empty for 100 years. It was then, in the early 16th century, that King Francis I came to the throne and decided to make Fontainebleau his passion project.
Donc c'est François Ier qui va redécouvrir le site de Fontainebleau, c'est-à-dire la forêt, et redécouvrir au milieu de cette forêt l'existence d'un château qui est à ce moment-là en très mauvais état. Il est inhabitable, les bâtiments sont en grande partie ruinés, et il va décider, à partir de 1527, de reconstruire le château et d'en faire une de ses résidences favorites.
Francis was heavily influenced by the Renaissance movement that had begun in Italy. Ideas about design and architecture had transitioned from the medieval style of construction.
It's the Italian Renaissance that invents the modern idea of the architect. The classical buildings, which were emulating Rome, had to be drawn out in advance. They couldn't be worked out on site. And thus somebody had to do the drawings and hand these to the builders to build.
King Francis employed a master mason named Gilles Le Breton to oversee the build. His construction team helped to turn the medieval castle into a palace fit for a king.
The construction of the new wings of the castle wasn't particularly revolutionary. It was the way it was carried out, the style in which it was carried out, that was so radically different. The stone ashlar that was cut with beautiful fine joints wasn't radically different from the medieval stonework, but it was the creation of classical ornament of capitals and friezes and cornices. And some of these presented technical difficulties. The cornice is a very heavy element, and it's right at the top of the building, and it cantilevers out, it stretches out over the front of the building, so that you have to lift the heaviest stones to the top of the building.
When you've got a structure that's being constantly changed over a period of time, where new things are being added in, old things are being taken away, one of the biggest challenges around that is making sure that we're keeping structural stability. If you imagine, the gravity loads are all kind of channeling their way through the structure in a particular path, and then if you're coming in and changing those pathways, it's really important to make sure that the forces find a different way to travel. And often what you do to ensure that is to put some temporary supports in there, and that way you can be sure that the forces do have somewhere safe to dissipate.
The most recognizable thing about the architecture of Francis I, the Renaissance wings, is its classical style. Its use of classical columns taken from the books of Vitruvius, a Roman author, and their later interpretations by Italian writers. The use of these is essential in classical architecture.
In the mid-16th century, King Francis I had decided to update the medieval castle of Fontainebleau. The interiors of Francis's new-look home were designed to showcase the groundbreaking artwork of the Renaissance.
The Italian Renaissance, the movement of art, the growth of art, the idea of almost a sort of a realistic art and the flowering of arts and culture during the 15th century. This began in Italy, and Francis I very much wanted to see it in his own palaces, and Fontainebleau was the place he used. Everything about it was a symbol of beauty and Francis's power, and the way he's doing that is not just through seeming strong and success in war, but also seeming like the great king of art and culture and the Renaissance and the rebirth. And certainly the influence of Fontainebleau on France can't be understated.
Francis invited Italian artists Rosso Fiorentino and Francesco Primaticcio over to France to turn his dream into a reality. They helped decorate a huge new hall for the king, the Gallery of Francis I.
Under the reign of Francis I wanted all these Italian artists to come at his court. And Rosso, Fiorentino, and Primaticcio came in Fontainebleau, and they really infused French art with what they did and what they saw in Italy. So the School of Fontainebleau is really a school in the proper sense of the term. You have these important Italian masters, and you have a whole squad, a whole team of young French artists that will learn how to do fresco, or how to do a beautiful leg, or a beautiful arm, or very fleshy fruits under the guidance of these masters. And when they will leave the works at Fontainebleau, and when they will work in Paris or elsewhere in France, they will use what they learned. And so that's how all the Fontainebleau style is becoming popular in France, and will infuse really French art of the 16th century.
King Francis's private gallery has 14 different frescoes along the walls, painted by the school of Fontainebleau during the 1530s.
So here you have Danae. Danae embodies the beautiful girl of the Renaissance, doesn't she? With her golden hair, her sophisticated hairdo, her almond-shaped eyes, and her body with the robustness that recalls the art of Giulio Romano in Mantua, and also the gracefulness of the face that recalls the art of Raphael. And really that's the school of Fontainebleau. Danae lies on her very beautiful bed, and you can see this kind of golden shower that is just going down on her. And this golden shower is Jupiter manifesting himself under the appearance of gold, and he will fecundate this way Danae, and this will give birth to Perseus. Around this beautiful fresco, you have these great caryatids carrying baskets of fruits. And look, the opulence and the abundance and the richness of these fruits, with the huge fruits of Italy, very big, very fleshy. This is really a signature of the gallery of Francis I.
As well as being incredibly beautiful, the artwork forms part of the structural design of the gallery.
A fresco is not just a painting on plaster. The plaster and the paint are mixed, which makes it particularly difficult to do, as you have to paint before the plaster dries, and the plaster has to be mixed in such a way that there's time for the painter to finish their work each day, and the painting has to be split into segments to allow this to happen.
The gallery measures 60 meters long, 6 meters wide, and 5 meters high. Before the 18th century renovations at the palace, it had windows on both sides of the room.
The gallery was a particularly impressive space, partly because of its huge length. It's obviously a very large building, far larger than anyone else would have been used to seeing. But it also contained an awful lot of glass, and glass in this period is tremendously expensive. The only way to make windows was to take a sheet of glass and spin it so it spun out like a plate, and then cut rectangles out of this circular disc of glass. So each rectangle was relatively small, and these were then mounted in larger windows. Ordinary people very often didn't have glass at all. So to have a huge gallery with windows down one or even both sides filled with glass, which was so expensive, showed off how rich you were.
Almost hidden away amongst the frescoes in the gallery is a 16th century depiction of Francis I's new Renaissance wing.
Well, this is kind of the first photograph of Fontainebleau. So you can recognize the Porte Dorée, the pond that is just in front of you, and where all the arcades are, it's where we are right now, the gallery. You can see that people are bathing in the pond, and it's a very lovely scene. And the bigger fresco represents Venus in her bath. And it's very important for Fontainebleau because you have to remember that downstairs there used to be a full appartement des bains, 7 rooms dedicated exclusively to bath.
The lavish royal baths that were once plumbed in directly below the gallery have since been removed.
having a room in your house devoted entirely to bathing was virtually unique. And of course, all of the associated plumbing and everything that was required would have been completely innovative. The same kind of technology that was being employed in Renaissance fountains and elsewhere to create water displays was there to be used in creating Francis I's bathroom. It was the fact that it was being used for a bathroom that was unusual.
The bathrooms were even adorned with artworks of the day, including one of the world's most priceless portraits.
Bath apartment housed the collection of paintings of Francis I, with some paintings not very famous, such as the Mona Lisa, or all the big Raphaels that are in the Louvre. They were all exposed in this appartement des bains downstairs in the Château de Fontainebleau.
There was art everywhere in the palace, and including the fact that the Mona Lisa was at one point hung in some of the bathrooms, that this great priceless painting, the most priceless painting now in the world, was just stuck in a bathroom because they had so many other great pieces of art that almost the Mona Lisa was just a footnote.
Another grand addition to Fontainebleau was the stunning ballroom. It was still under construction when Francis I died in 1547.
So we are in the Salle de Bal of the Château de Fontainebleau, a space that was conceived under the reign of Francis I, but only accomplished under the reign of its son, King Henry II. All that you can see on the walls or on the ceiling are the work of Italian artists who came to Fontainebleau in the 16th century to work for the kings of France. For example, the frescoes were done by Niccolò dell'Abate upon the drawings of Francesco Primaticcio, one of the most important representatives of what is called the first school of Fontainebleau.
After the death of Rosso Fiorentino in 1540, Francesco Primaticcio had taken sole control of the artistic direction at Fontainebleau. The frescoes in the ballroom are all his creation.
So here you have the Feast of Bacchus. You can recognize Bacchus in the center. He's a bit greenish now, with the cup he's holding in his hand and the grape wreath he has on his head. Then you move to this arcade where you see Apollo playing a kind of lute for the muses on Mount Parnassus. And look how the drapery here overhangs on the architecture, or how the arm of this lovely lady playing the flute is climbing on the arch. So there you see how much in Fontainebleau architecture and painting are fusing with one another, and that's really the school of Fontainebleau. It's because architecture, sculpture, painting are all imagined together by just one mind, and here it was the mind of Primaticcio.
To top it all off, an intricately carved wooden ceiling sits above the 10-meter-high room. This was an amendment by Henry II to the original plan by his father, Francis I. Francis had commissioned an arched ceiling, held up by pillars which were built and still remain in the gallery, despite not being needed. Henry II's new architect changed the plans to include the more fashionable wooden ceiling.
It was conceived by Francis Siebeck de Carpi, an Italian cabinet maker that also worked for the Louvre or for the Château de Beauregard. So it's a wooden ceiling with these kind of coffers with the emblems of Henry II, the crescent, and the cipher of Henry II with the H. And you see all the work of gilding, of working in the wood that is really typical of these ceilings of the Renaissance.
In 1589, the House of Bourbon became the new royal dynasty in France. Henry IV was the first Bourbon ruler and continued the elaborate additions to Fontainebleau that had been started by Francis I over 60 years beforehand. The differences between Henry's and Francis I's palaces can be seen from the oval courtyard.
On reconnaît sur la façade le F de François Ier qui alterne avec la salamandre qui était son emblème particulier. Donc on reconnaît cette période de construction des années 1540 qui est le règne de François Ier. Mais le bâtiment a été prolongé et la cour a été régularisée par Henri IV, qui est un des personnages importants aussi de l'histoire de ce château. Et on voit que sur certains médaillons de cette façade, le F de François Ier est remplacé par le H de Henri IV. On retrouve du côté nord les deux grandes périodes de construction de la cour d'une certaine façon, avec à l'extrémité sur le pavillon des cheminées sur lesquelles on voit le H de Henri IV. Et de ce côté-ci, en revanche, on retrouve le F de François Ier.
The artistic traditions begun in Fontainebleau under Francis are then continued under Henry IV, who elaborates and increases the size of the building. And architects like Andrea de Cerceau, who come in and produce this amazing staircase, this double horseshoe staircase in front of the building.
King Henry IV's renovations at Fontainebleau extended beyond just bricks and mortar. He cultivated the medieval parks surrounding the palace and created 3 gardens within the 130-acre grounds. Today, Arnaud Amelot is in charge of them.
Donc on a d'abord le jardin de Diane où nous nous trouvons actuellement, qui couvre à peu près une surface de 2,5 hectares. Nous avons le jardin anglais qui est à peu près de 11 hectares et le jardin français qui couvre 14 hectares. Et à côté de ça, au-delà du jardin français, ce que nous appelons le parc, qui est un grand espace qui s'organise autour du Grand Canal, qui fait à peu près 83 hectares. Donc vous voyez que c'est assez grand, c'est multiple, très diversifié, avec chaque jardin qui a des caractéristiques propres, qui a une ambiance particulière, des spécificités qui sont tout à fait étonnantes dans l'histoire des jardins.
These gardens really symbolise the belief in French society at the time of the importance of symmetry, of the importance of regularity. That's what they believed, that if you can tame and civilise the garden, then you can tame and civilise everything and you can build an empire. And that's what these gardens are so symbolic of.
The Roman goddess of the hunt, Diana, features heavily in the gardens and the palace itself.
Alors Diane, c'est un personnage mythologique de la mythologie gréco-romaine qui a toute sa place ici et une importance cruciale. Pourquoi ? Parce que finalement, Fontainebleau était un lieu de chasse très apprécié par tous les souverains qui se sont succédés à travers les siècles. Alors là, on voit cette Diane à la biche, qui est donc une sculpture en bronze. Ce n'est pas l'original. L'original a été déposé à l'intérieur de la Galerie des Serres, puisqu'en fait c'est une sculpture fragile qui donc a été protégée à l'intérieur parmi d'autres sculptures en bronze qui datent pour beaucoup de la Renaissance.
King Henry also added a number of artificial bodies of water to the gardens, including the carp pond, the cascades, and the 1,200-metre-long Grand Canal. Commissioned in 1610, the canal was one of the first created in France and certainly the biggest at the time. The excavation of the man-made channel called for some engineering expertise.
Et qui plus est, ce grand canal a une disposition très particulière parce qu'il est construit sur la moitié de sa surface en hors-sol. Normalement, un grand canal est simplement creusé, alors que lui, il est à la fois creusé et à la fois construit sur des digues. Et c'est ça aussi qui est l'originalité de ce grand canal, c'est qu'on a fait des travaux de terrassement considérables, on a récupéré, on a refaçonné, on a reprofilé le terrain pour récupérer les terres, les argiles, pour créer l'étanchéité de ce canal et pour construire les digues qui sont tout à fait à l'extrémité est, au bout du grand canal.
The vast canal was fed by water diverted from both the carp pond and the River Seine, 4 kilometers northeast of Fontainebleau. The king and one of his courtiers had a wager on how successful the irrigation would be.
En même temps, il y a une petite anecdote, un pari qui a été pris entre Henri IV et le maréchal de Bassompierre pour savoir quel serait le nombre de jours pour remplir à nouveau le Grand Canal. Le maréchal de Bassompierre disait qu'il se remplirait en 2 jours, alors que le roi Henri IV parlait, lui, d'un temps beaucoup plus long. Et en fait, c'est Henri IV qui avait raison. En réalité, il faut beaucoup de jours pour remplir l'eau avec donc le Grand Canal, parce que ça représente à peu près 140 000 mètres cubes d'eau. Donc c'est quand même une échelle gigantesque. Donc pour l'anecdote, c'est bien le roi qui avait raison sur son courtisan.
164 years after the death of Henry IV, his 5-time great-grandson, Louis XVI, became King of France in 1774. Louis and his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, would escape from the palace of Versailles near Paris to Fontainebleau every autumn, just in time for the hunting season.
Marie-Antoinette aime beaucoup Fontainebleau parce que c'est une résidence au milieu de la nature où elle est sans doute un peu plus libre qu'à Versailles. Et Louis XVI et Marie-Antoinette vont faire des travaux relativement importants à Fontainebleau et plusieurs pièces aujourd'hui présentent un décor qui a été fait pour la reine Marie-Antoinette.
Some of the most opulent rooms at Fontainebleau were decorated specifically for the Queen.
She brought exoticism into Fontainebleau. Marie Antoinette's rooms in Fontainebleau were absolutely amazing. And to Louis and Marie Antoinette, they were just doing everything exactly the same as all the monarchs before had done. You make Fontainebleau into this beautiful palace.
La chambre de la reine a été très largement redécorée pour Marie-Antoinette. Et on a livré un magnifique lit en bois sculpté et doré pour la reine Marie-Antoinette en 1787. Mais le dernier séjour de Louis XVI et Marie-Antoinette à Fontainebleau se situe 1 an plus tôt. Ce qui fait que cet extraordinaire lit livré pour Marie-Antoinette, elle ne l'a jamais utilisé.
Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette never returned to Fontainebleau after 1786. Their subjects were turning against them.
By this point, with the growth of revolutionary feeling, with the growth of republican feeling, it seems too much when you have a country which is struggling for money to spend all this money on Versailles, to spend all this money on Fontainebleau, for the Queen to build these huge rooms to have fun with all her friends. Well, now, what once had seemed like great patronage, like a great symbol, what once had seemed like the king showing his love for France, now seemed like selfishness, now seemed like spending the country's money. And so, although a lot of the focus about excess and extravagance was focused on Versailles, there was also criticism of Marie Antoinette's rooms in Fontainebleau, about how much she'd spent and about how divorced, really, she was from the reality of ordinary French people.
During the French Revolution of 1789 to 1799, a young man from Corsica named Napoleon Bonaparte arrived in Paris to help topple the monarchy. Christophe Bayer has been writing books about one of history's greatest military leaders for over a decade.
Et c'est cet homme, désabusé et libéré de toute allégeance à la dynastie légitime, qui passe avec armes et bagages au service de la Révolution, pousse des bœufs pour aller vers Toulon porter des munitions à l'armée révolutionnaire qui met le siège devant la ville où les royalistes ont pris les armes, protégés par les canons de la flotte anglaise qui, depuis la rade, repousse les assauts des troupes révolutionnaires. Et là, parce qu'il ne perd jamais une minute, il se trouve que, lors d'un déplacement en mer depuis Toulon jusque vers la Corse, il avait quelques heures à perdre. À perdre, que dis-je? Pour rien au monde, Bonaparte eût perdu ne fût-ce qu'une minute. Il fait le tour des murailles, il analyse la disposition des points, il observe les hauteurs et il fait dans sa tête le plan idéal d'un siège. Arrivant plusieurs années plus tard à Toulon, il dit c'est là qu'il faut mettre le canon. Le point pris, les canons foudroient la flotte anglaise. Les Anglais quittent la rade, abandonnent leurs alliés royalistes, qui sont massacrés. Le jeune Bonaparte, en même temps que les armées révolutionnaires dans Toulon, entre dans l'histoire.
The palace had been ransacked during the Revolution, so before Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France in December 1804, he began renovating Fontainebleau.
En 1804, pour recevoir le pape qui vient pour son couronnement, Napoléon va décider qu'il faut remeubler le château. Donc on apporte depuis Paris ou depuis les autres résidences énormément de meubles qui sont destinés à remeubler cette résidence. Et petit à petit, le château va être réparé, remeublé, embelli et habité de temps en temps par l'empereur et par sa cour.
Napoleon was a military man who had no desire for wonderful food or beautiful art or beautiful wall hangings or lovely sculptures. He really didn't like them, but he used them as a way of bolstering his power, of intimidating foreign visitors, as a way of intimidating the French, as a way of saying, I am the richest.
Even to this day, the majority of the furniture at Fontainebleau dates back to Napoleon's residence at the palace during the early 19th century.
Et ce mobilier inégalable qui fait que Fontainebleau est le grand conservatoire au monde du style empire, ce mobilier inégalable, vous le voyez ici, dans la salle du trône, la seule subsistante en France et en Europe, du datant de l'Empire. Ce trône se compose d'un fauteuil, d'enseignes sommées d'une aigle romaine, empiétant, enserrant, un foudre. Et le foudre, qu'est-ce que c'est ? C'est l'éclair, fulgur en latin, qui est dardé par Jupiter pour foudroyer ses ennemis et abattre les titans qui oseraient se dresser face à lui.
Despite being a great man of the people, French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte enjoyed playing the role of king at Fontainebleau.
Napoleon was the revolutionary hero, the Republican hero, the great army hero, and yet, when he became emperor, everything was excess and gold and red and bling. He said, all you have to do to fool people is throw gold dust in their eyes. And Fontainebleau was a way in which he threw gold dust into the eyes of ambassadors, of ministers, of the army.
By 1813, Napoleon had conquered most of Europe, but the Allied coalition of Prussia, Austria, and Russia were fighting back. After defeating Napoleon at the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, they invaded France and conquered Paris in the spring of 1814. It was the end of the road for the emperor.
Donc cette abdication, Napoléon va la signer à Fontainebleau dans son appartement le 6 avril 1814, contraint par son entourage, alors que lui n'est pas décidé à céder le pouvoir. Et puis, quelques jours plus tard, le 20 avril, il va partir pour l'île d'Elbe et il va donc traverser la grande cour du château et faire là ses adieux à la garde, qui est véritablement son entourage militaire. Et il va faire à ce moment-là un discours très mémorable auprès de sa garde.
Soldats de ma vieille garde, je vous fais mes adieux. Pendant 20 ans, sur les chemins de l'Europe, je vous ai trouvé répondant à l'honneur et à la gloire. Nous aurions pu poursuivre la lutte, c'eût été la guerre civile. Adieu, je m'en vais pour écrire notre histoire.
It was incredibly emotional because he'd fought tooth and nail to get that throne, and he'd fought tooth and nail to hold on to it. And you see the moment in which he's reduced in Fontainebleau, in which he becomes no longer the emperor, no longer the great military campaigner who no one thought could lose anything. He becomes just a man.
In February 1815, Napoleon escaped his exile on Elba and seized power of France once more. But it was fleeting. He was defeated for a second and final time at the Battle of Waterloo in June 1815.
Il prend les devants, franchit les frontières de l'actuelle Belgique, livre bataille face à un Anglais alcoolique et tenace. Wellington manque de plier, c'est Blücher qui sauve la mise. Napoléon est balayé, il ne repassera jamais à Fontainebleau. Il demande, l'imprudent, l'hospitalité à l'Angleterre. L'Angleterre, en guise d'hospitalité, lui réserve un rocher battu par les vents et les tempêtes au fin fond de l'Atlantique Sud.
While imprisoned on the island of St. Helena, Napoleon still had his favorite residence on his mind.
Et il pense à son cher Fontainebleau, où il passa plus de 170 jours, ce qui est énorme pour quelqu'un qui a couru à travers l'Europe, et il donnera cette merveilleuse définition. Fontainebleau, la maison des siècles, la vraie demeure des rois.
After the defeat of Napoleon, the French monarchy was restored. In 1830, King Louis-Philippe, the fifth cousin of Louis XVI, resided at Fontainebleau. Like so many of his predecessors, the king added a modern innovation to the Renaissance wing of the palace for his sister, Madame Adelaide.
This is the chaise volante of Madame Adélaïde, the flying chair. It's the precursor of an elevator. And it was used by Madame Adélaïde, the sister of King Louis-Philippe, who lived very often in Fontainebleau. She was living in the petits appartements downstairs, and as she had a very fragile condition, she needed an elevator to come more often to see her brother, who lived upstairs in the castle. So Madame Adélaïde, the king's sister, would enter her elevator this way, through this little balustrade. A chair would be placed on this platform, then you would close it like this. And then downstairs, people would use the crank and the wheel to take her downstairs.
We're used to it in modern elevators, an electric motor powering an elevator fast up and down a shaft. This elevator is operated by hand, a servant or servants cranking it. It would have moved very slowly up and down with the accompanying noises and creaks and groans.
So Madame Adélaïde was put on her chair upstairs and taken down through, you see these cables, to access her apartments that are at the first level of the castle. And you can see here the wheel with the crank mechanism that was manually activated by two people that were responsible for lifting up and down the princess.
The 19th century elevator used technology that can be linked back to the ancient Mesopotamians.
So at the time, the technology would have been pretty basic. They would have been using a pulley system. Pulley systems have been in existence for thousands of years. In simple form, you've got a wheel, you've got a rope that's wrapped around it, and then you use a winch system to either wrap the rope around the pulley or to unravel it, which then allows the platform itself to move up and down.
Here, it's really the arrival of modernity in a Renaissance world.
So even though it is a very basic, simple form of engineering, for me, it embodies what engineering is about, which is making people's lives easier and better.
In 1848, the French monarchy fell again, with the country electing Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, Louis Napoleon, as president. By 1852, he had declared himself Emperor Napoleon III and, like his uncle, took ownership of Fontainebleau.
À partir du début de son règne, en 1852, Napoléon III et son épouse, l'impératrice Eugénie, vont venir régulièrement à Fontainebleau et vont y faire des travaux relativement importants. C'est eux notamment qui vont faire construire et aménager un nouveau théâtre dans le château, qui existe toujours, qu'on vient de restaurer, et qui est un théâtre de à peu près 420 places, qui est construit entre 1852 et 1855, et qui a été inauguré en 1857.
The theatre was designed by French architect Hector Lefuel who converted part of an 18th century wing at Fontainebleau into a private auditorium for the emperor and his entourage.
Effectivement, cette division de la salle de spectacle en plusieurs niveaux, avec le premier niveau qui est le parterre, qui est plutôt réservé aux officiers, donc aux personnes qui portent l'uniforme militaire, puis la loge impériale, la place pour les invités, que l'on retrouve sur une deuxième galerie.
It's a miniature opera house with all the features of a great opera house, but scaled down. It's horseshoe-shaped, which was good for acoustics, but most importantly, good for lines of sight. It was lit by candles. Although it could have been lit by gas at this era, it seems to have been deliberately old-fashioned.
All the audience members, who were guests of the emperor, were seated on a comfortable cushioned chair, upholstered in luxurious silk. But even though the entire theatre appears to be garnished with expensive adornments, the stunning architecture is mainly a facade.
Tout cela, une fois que l'ossature est construite, on vient la remplir de plâtre et c'est ensuite directement sur le plâtre que l'on vient appliquer le décor au pochoir ou un décor qui est effectué par moulage. C'est ce que l'on appelle du carton-pierre. Donc c'est une technique qui permet d'imiter la sculpture, mais en même temps d'effectuer des ornements reproductibles à l'infini et qu'ensuite on vient dorer et mettre en place simplement en les clouant. Donc c'est toutes ces techniques qui permettent d'être très très rapide et de, j'allais dire, en mettre quelque part plein la vue, mais avec des moyens très simples.
Despite creating the lavish-looking theatre, the emperor rarely used it.
D'un point de vue personnel, on ne peut pas dire que Napoléon III soit un grand amateur de théâtre. Il n'aime pas l'opéra. L'impératrice n'est pas non plus une grande experte en matière de théâtre. Donc c'est plutôt cette dimension de divertissement de la cour et en même temps de montrer effectivement la majesté, la magnificence du Second Empire.
But the Second Empire only lasted for 18 years. In 1870, Napoleon III was captured during the Franco-Prussian War, and France declared itself a republic once more.
Napoléon III était le dernier souverain, le dernier empereur à habiter à Fontainebleau. Normalement, après Napoléon III, le château n'accueille plus de personnage qui est au pouvoir.
Château de Fontainebleau has been open to the public as a museum since 1927. Beloved by kings and emperors, 500,000 visitors per year come to explore the 1,500 rooms and immerse themselves in 8 centuries of French history.
Le château de Fontainebleau est une ancienne résidence royale et impériale qui a été habitée par les souverains, par les rois, par les empereurs depuis le Moyen-Âge et qui a conservé de toutes les périodes de son existence des traces dans son architecture, dans ses décors, dans son ameublement. Ce qui fait que le château de Fontainebleau peut être considéré comme une sorte de résumé de l'histoire de France depuis la période médiévale jusqu'au 19e ou au 20e siècle.
Napoleon called Fontainebleau the true home of kings, and I think it is that special. It's beautiful, it's amazing. You see all of French history in one, but you also see the rise and fall of kings, how fragile monarchy can be.